Wake TF up. Welcome to the Sovereign Signal, the channel of sovereign fire. The foundations of public ownership. In the ashes of the Second World War, nations faced a brutal truth. Survival depended on rebuilding the lifelines of modern life. Bombed out cities, shattered industries, and millions of households without reliable access to water, electricity, or communication demanded urgent action. The question was not whether utilities mattered. It was who would control them. The answer, in that moment of clarity, was simple. The people themselves. Utilities were not luxuries. They were lifelines. They were treated as public goods, built and maintained by the people, for the people. Governments across Europe and North America nationalized or municipally owned utilities, embedding them into the social contract. UK. Labour's post-war government nationalized electricity in 1947, gas in 1948, and water in 1973. Telecoms were run by the post office. France. Électricité de France, EDF, was created in 1946 as a state monopoly, ensuring universal access. Germany. Municipal utilities provided water and electricity, owned by local councils, accountable to citizens. U.S. Roosevelt's New Deal built dams, power stations, and rural electrification projects, bringing light to communities that private companies had ignored. The principle was clear. Necessities belong to the people. The people's investment. Every dam, every power station, every water treatment plant, every telephone exchange was built with taxpayer money. Infrastructure. Paid for by the public purse, not private shareholders. Workers. Public servants accountable to communities, not corporate boards. Profits. Reinvested into networks, expanding access, modernizing systems, ensuring resilience. This was sovereignty in action. The people owned the lifelines of survival. Venom truth. Utilities were ours. We built them. We paid for them. They were public goods, not corporate assets. Grandparents' era, 1950s, 1970s. For the grandparents' generation, the promise matched reality. Affordable bills. Electricity, gas, and water were priced fairly. Universal access. Rural electrification, municipal water systems, national telecoms, no community left behind. Security. Jobs and utilities were stable, pensions reliable, services guaranteed. Grandparents lived with dignity, knowing their bills were fair and their services secure. Utilities were not commodities, they were rights. The ethos of public ownership was not charity. It was recognition that survival cannot be left to markets. Electricity, a household necessity, not a profit stream. Water, a human right, not a dividend. Telecoms, a public service, not a monopoly. This ethos was embedded in policy, culture, and everyday life. Utilities were part of the social contract. The slap in the face. The grandparents' era proved that public ownership worked. Bills were affordable. Access was universal. Infrastructure was maintained. Workers were respected. Communities were secure. But this sovereignty was temporary. Politicians and corporations saw opportunity. They saw assets built by the people, funded by the people, owned by the people, and they plotted to steal them. Case studies of public ownership. 1. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, USA. Created in 1933, the TVA built dams, electrified rural areas, and transformed one of the poorest regions in America. Funded by taxpayers, it provided cheap electricity, flood control, and jobs. It was proof that public ownership could lift entire regions out of poverty. 2. Électricité de France, EDF. Formed in 1946, EDF became the backbone of France's energy system. It guaranteed universal access, reinvested profits into infrastructure, and built one of the most reliable electricity networks in Europe. 3. UK nationalizations. Electricity, gas, and water were brought under public control. The post office ran telecoms, ensuring universal service. Bills were affordable, and infrastructure expanded rapidly. 4. German Stadtwerk, municipal utilities. Local councils owned and operated utilities, accountable directly to citizens. Profits were reinvested locally, strengthening communities. Statistics of public ownership. UK electricity, 1950s. Coverage expanded to nearly 100% of households. U.S. rural electrification. By 1950, 90% of rural homes had electricity, compared to 10% in 1930. France, EDF. Universal access achieved within decades, with reinvestment into nuclear power, ensuring long-term stability. Germany, Stadtwerk. Municipal utilities reinvested profits locally, funding schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. These numbers prove the point. Public ownership worked. Political speeches and propaganda. Politicians of the post-war era understood the ethos of public ownership. Speeches emphasized dignity, fairness, and sovereignty. Utilities were described as the people's lifelines, the backbone of survival, and rights, not commodities. The propaganda of the time celebrated nationalization as a victory for democracy. Posters showed families switching on lights, turning on taps, and making phone calls, all thanks to public ownership. Venomed truth. The grandparents' era was proof that sovereignty worked. Utilities were affordable, universal, and secure. Infrastructure was maintained. Workers were respected. Communities were strong, but this sovereignty was temporary. Politicians and corporations saw opportunity. They saw assets built by the people, funded by the people, owned by the people, and they plotted to steal them. Energy and utilities. The Cage of Necessity. Part 2. The Great Theft. Privatization and the Lie of Competition. The turning point. From sovereignty to sale by the late 1970s and early 1980s, the grandparents' generation had proven that public ownership worked. Utilities were affordable, universal, and secure. Infrastructure was maintained. Workers were respected. Communities were strong. But politicians and corporations saw opportunity. They saw assets built by the people, funded by the people, owned by the people, and they plotted to steal them. The theft was dressed up in propaganda. Competition lowers prices. Private investment improves efficiency. Choice empowers consumers. This was the beginning of the great privatization wave. The 1980s-1990s wave. The UK led the charge under Margaret Thatcher. British Telecom, BT, privatized in 1984, sold as freedom of choice. In reality, it became a private monopoly, charging line rental fees long after the technology justified them. British Gas, privatized in 1986. Shares were marketed to the public with the slogan, "Tell Sid." Millions bought in, but foreign investors soon dominated ownership. Electricity, privatized in 1989. Regional boards were broken up, sold off, and profits siphoned to shareholders. Water, privatized in 1989. 10 regional water authorities became private companies. Bills rose, dividends flowed, and sewage spilled into rivers. Rail, privatized in the 1990s. Fragmented, chaotic, and plagued by accidents. Globally, the IMF and World Bank pushed privatization through structural adjustment programs. Nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia were told, privatize your utilities or lose access to loans. Sovereignty was stripped in exchange for debt relief. The reality behind the lie, the promises collapsed almost immediately. Water. Privatized companies in England and Wales paid billions in dividends while sewage spilled into rivers. Bills rose faster than inflation. Electricity. Prices soared. Profits went to shareholders. Infrastructure underinvested. Telecoms. BT became a monopoly in private hands. Line rental charges persisted even as technology advanced. Gas. Foreign ownership siphoned profits abroad. The lie was exposed. Privatization did not lower prices. It raised them. It did not improve efficiency. It cut corners. It did not empower consumers. It trapped them. Proof in numbers. National Audit Office, UK. Water bills rose by 40% in real terms since privatization. Ofgem, UK regulator. Energy bills rose sharply post-privatization, especially after deregulation. Thames Water paid £7.2 billion in dividends since privatization, while dumping sewage into rivers. BT extracted billions in line rental charges, long after the cost of maintaining lines justified them. OECD studies. Privatization rarely lowered prices, often raised them. Parents' era, 1980s-2000s. For the parents' generation, the promises collapsed. Bills rose. Families paid more for services they had already funded through taxes. Profits siphoned. Dividends flowed to shareholders, often overseas. Infrastructure neglected. Investment lagged. Systems decayed. Resilience weakened. Debt traps. IMF and World Bank forced privatization globally, stripping nations of sovereignty. Parents were trapped. They paid higher bills for services they had already built. Sovereignty was stolen. The propaganda machine privatization was sold with slick campaigns. Tell Sid, British Gas. A slogan designed to make privatization look like empowerment. Millions bought shares, but ownership quickly concentrated in corporate hands. BT Advertising. Promised freedom of choice, but delivered monopoly pricing. Water companies. Marketed privatization as modernization, while dumping sewage into rivers. Globally, the IMF and World Bank framed privatization as structural reform. In reality, it was structural theft. Venom truth. The grandparents' generation built utilities with dignity. The parents' generation watched them stolen. Politicians lied. Corporations looted. Sovereignty was stripped. Privatization was not reform. It was theft. Case Studies 1. Thames Water, UK. Since privatization, Thames Water has paid billions in dividends while failing to invest in infrastructure. Sewage spills into rivers, bills rise, and profits flow abroad. 2. BT Line Rental. BT charged households billions in line rental fees, long after the cost of maintaining lines justified them. A private monopoly extracting wealth from families. 3. Latin American water wars. In Bolivia, privatization of water in Cochabamba led to mass protests. Families were charged exorbitant rates for access to water. Sovereignty was reclaimed only through uprising. 4. IMF structural adjustment. Across Africa, nations were forced to privatize utilities in exchange for loans. Sovereignty was stripped, profits siphoned abroad, and communities trapped. Generational cage tightens. Parents inherited the theft. Children inherited the cage. Bills soared. Energy poverty spread. Families forced to choose between heating and eating. Water polluted. Companies dumped sewage into rivers while paying billions in dividends. Telecoms gouged. Line rental charges persisted. Broadband overpriced. Rural communities neglected. Foreign ownership. Profits siphoned abroad. Communities trapped. Sovereignty destroyed. The slap in the face. They told you privatization meant freedom. They told you competition meant lower prices. They told you choice meant empowerment. But the longer you walk this path, the more you see the trap. The game is monopoly. Corporations own the water, the electricity, the telecoms, the bills, and the future. The people built it. The corporations stole it. Sovereignty is the prize. This is the Sovereign Signal. Support the mission. Like, share, subscribe. Wake TF up.